So when he came home that evening and Josh practically knocked him over at the back door with the news about Joe, Michael just stared him right in the eyes and asked him for if dinner was ready. Josh took a step back, his mouth open. "Did you hear me? Joe's in jail," he repeated. "See, I was right. He's the killer." Michael held his fist only a few inches from Josh's nose. "He's no killer, you little dork, so shut your stupid face." He unclenched his hand and let it drop to his side. "Got it?" "Got it," Josh said, blinking wildly, just as Karen McKenzie came through the back door with an armload of groceries. She looked from Michael to Josh, then frowned. "Is something wrong?" "They caught the killer," Josh said, not daring to look at his brother. Karen McKenzie sighed and brushed her damp hair away from her forehead. "They only took Joe in for questioning," she told him. "He wasn't arrested." "But everybody's pretty sure he did it," Josh said, growing excited again. His mother set the bag of groceries on the kitchen counter and began to empty it. "It's wrong to just assume someone's guilty," she told Josh. "The police are only trying to get to the bottom of this. They're questioning a lot of people." She shifted her glance to Michael. He noticed how drawn and tired her face looked. There were dark smudges beneath her eyes. It occurred to him that maybe she hadn't been getting much sleep since Healy and Boyle had found the casing in the backyard. And why should she? No matter how any of this turned out, her mother knew the rifle had been fired from her backyard while she had been overseeing the party. For the first time, Michael realized that his parents probably held themselves responsible for Charlie Ward's death. His mother was watching him. Michael felt a tingling in the tips of his fingers. He wondered if she suspected something, but she only said, "Joe's going to be fine. I called his mother from work as soon as I heard. He should be home by now. Why don't you give him a call?" Michael said he'd do that, although he had absolutely no intention of calling Joe, and then headed straight for his room. He needed some place to think. He couldn't believe Healy and Boyle had talked to all 40 of his friends already. He had thought it would take weeks, or were they just questioning Joe the way they were everyone else? Maybe this was simply part of the investigation, but he knew better. Friends of his at the pool who had been at the party had told him the police had come to their homes, asked a few questions, and that was it. This was different. The police had taken Joe down to the station. He was definitely a major suspect. Michael couldn't stop thinking about him. He wondered how Joe had handled things, or if he had told the cops anything. Maybe they had broken him down, gotten a confession out of him. For all he knew, they might come knocking on Michael's own door any minute with a warrant for his arrest. He finally decided that he couldn't just sit there hiding in his room. He had to know what had happened. He headed back downstairs. "I'm going over to Joe's," he called out into the kitchen as he pushed open the front screen door. "I'll be back in time for dinner." He knew he could have called Joe, but he was afraid the police might have tapped his phone. He was probably being paranoid, but he didn't want to take any chances. A few minutes later, as he hurried across Joe's front lawn, something caught Michael's attention. He barely glanced across the street, preoccupied with what he was going to say to Joe, but in that single moment he thought he saw Jenna Ward standing by a tree. Badly shaken, he climbed the front steps of Joe's house and rang the bell. Then he sneaked a furtive look over his shoulder. No one was across the street. "Man, you really are paranoid," he thought. His mother had been right. Joe was home. When he came to the front door, he just stood there, staring at Michael. Finally, he said, "You sure you want to be seen with a hardened criminal?" Michael winced. "I thought they just took you in for questioning. They didn't actually arrest you, did they?" "You're right, they didn't," Joe sneered. "Does that make you feel better?" Michael peered around Joe, squinting into the dark foyer to see if anyone was listening. "Maybe we shouldn't talk here," he said. "Do we have something to talk about?" Joe's face was absolutely expressionless. Michael felt the weight of his friend's words on Michael's chest. He would have turned away, gone home right then, but his need to know what had happened at the police station was stronger than his sense of loss and humiliation. "I think we do," he said, trying to sound in control. Joe banged open the screen door with his fist and headed around to the backyard. Michael was right on his heels. He suspected Joe was going to the treehouse. These days the old treehouse was really no more than a wood platform with 2 walls and half a roof. The ladder that led to it was missing several rungs. Michael wondered why the Sadowskis had never torn it down. All their kids had grown up and had left home except for Joe, who was their youngest. And besides, the treehouse was a real eyesore. Still, it was the place where he and Joe could go talk, just as they had when they were small boys, and no one would overhear their conversation. Joe climbed the ladder, sat down cross-legged, and lit a cigarette. Michael sat across from him. "I thought you gave those things up." "What's it to you?" Joe was exhaling the stream of smoke in Michael's direction. This was not going to be a long conversation. Michael knew he had to ask what he had come for and then leave. He could tell that Joe was barely able to stand the sight of him. "So what happened down there? They didn't try to pin anything on you, did they?" Joe pulled his knees up close to his chest and took another drag from his cigarette, squinting to keep the smoke from burning his eyes. "I stuck to our original story, if that's what you're worried about." He shook his head. "Man, how many times do I have to tell you? Without the gun, they ain't got a case. They couldn't arrest me because they don't even have circumstantial evidence. Just a stupid hunch." Joe flicked his ashes over the edge. "So why did they bring you in for questioning?" Michael still couldn't understand it, especially if the cops really didn't have anything to go on. Why didn't they just talk to you here, like last time? "Who knows?" There was a definite edge to Joe's voice. "They wanted to know why I took so long filing the report for the stolen gun. Then they started harping on how there wasn't any damage to my car. They said it was a pretty clean robbery, no signs of a break-in." Michael noticed the thin mustache of sweat on Joe's upper lip. When he lifted the cigarette to his lips, his hand trembled. Whatever had gone on down at the police station had really shaken him up. "So what did you tell them?" Michael asked. Joe ran his thumbnail along his upper lip. I said for all I knew, I'd left the damn car unlocked. I said I couldn't remember that far back." "That's still not enough reason to take you down to the station," Michael said. Joe was squinting through the smoke. "Seems I got quite a reputation with the local powers that be. First they picked me up from the scene of a car accident drunk, then they charged me with being drunk and disorderly and with assault for stomping on that stupid bitch's windshield." He flicked more ashes over the side. "Let's face it, man, I ain't exactly their candidate for mayor." At the mention of Amy, Michael felt a rush of anger. But then Joe started talking again and Michael backed off. "Besides, a couple of kids from the party told them I was messing around with your rifle that day." Joe stared Michael right in the eye. Why would anyone say that? Michael was certain the only time Joe had ever held the gun was when they were in the woods. "Because it's true, man." He rubbed one eye with his palm. "You were off making it with that pig. Geez, I just wanted to look at it." This time, when Joe brought up Amy, Michael grabbed him by the front of his shirt. He almost threw him over the side. "Lay off Amy," he warned. Joe gave him an ugly sneer. "I think lay is the operative word here." Michael would have slammed his fist right into Joe's face if it hadn't suddenly sunk in that Joe had just confessed to being seen at the party with the rifle. Now a muddle of questions flooded his mind. Had Joe fired the gun that day without Michael's knowledge? If he had, then maybe Michael, wasn't the one who had killed Charlie Ward. He let go of Joe's shirt. "You said you had my Winchester that day?" he asked, trying not to sound as if he were accusing Joe of anything. "I was looking at it," Joe said. "I picked it up, that's all. I didn't do anything with it." He squashed his cigarette on the weathered boards. Michael was still staring down at the smoking butt when he heard Mr. Sadowski's voice below telling Joe that the police were there with a search warrant and that he'd better get himself inside. Fast. Suddenly, Michael was 11 years old again, and Mrs. Sadowski was peering over the top of the treehouse ladder, her face contorted in fury, screaming at him and Joe for sneaking a can of beer from the refrigerator. They had been sitting there, the half-empty can between them like a warm campfire until they'd been caught. "They think you've got the gun hidden here," Michael said when he could collect his thoughts. "No kidding, Sherlock." Joe stood up and stared down at him with disgust. "They think I'm their man," he said, "but they ain't going to find a thing. My dad's attorney was at the station with me this afternoon. He says they need hard evidence, and as far as I'm concerned, they ain't got diddly squat." It had gone this far. Mr. Sadowski's attorney had been there. Michael realized he would probably be needing an attorney himself soon. "What did you tell him? Your attorney, I mean." Joe snorted, then shook his head. "I told him I didn't fire the gun at the party. I said I didn't even have the stupid gun. I told him the truth, man." Joe stared up at the sky through the missing section of roof. He seemed to be thinking about something. "I asked him, though, just for jollies, what would happen to the person who did it." Michael did not want to hear what was coming next. It was all he could do to keep from leaping over the side of the treehouse and taking off at a run. But Joe was staring him down, and he didn't dare move a muscle. He said he'd probably be charged with involuntary manslaughter, which is pretty much what we figured in the first place. Unless, of course, he was stupid enough to try to conceal the evidence, which it seems would be an obstruction of justice. The judge might not be so understanding in that case. Michael massaged his forehead. His head had begun to ache. "What about the report you filed?" "Filing a false police report ain't exactly going to make their day either." Joe lowered himself onto the first rung of the ladder. "Oh yeah, there's this other thing. Shooting the gun off like you did, they nailed you for that too. Illegal discharge of a firearm." Michael hadn't said a word. His mouth was dry as sand. He wanted to tell Joe that they'd been wrong, that they should have gone to the police that morning as soon as they heard the announcement on the radio. But there didn't seem to be much point in bringing that up now, so he said nothing. Joe was watching him, a twisted grin on his face. "If they arrest you," Michael said, licking his lips, "I mean, if they think they've got a case or something, I'm going to tell them the truth." Joe snickered. "Sure you will," he said, backing down the ladder. "Any way you look at it, we're dead."